Such a thing.
Okay. Thank you to everyone for being here. This is terrific. On behalf of the ESPM Spring Seminar Committee, I am really excited to introduce this event, which is an ESPM faculty book panel in which we are celebrating the dedication of 3 of our ESPM faculty members, who our moderator will introduce in just a moment, in their persistence in bringing to light critical issues in their forthcoming books. And we're also going to have an opportunity to learn some of the process that they use to write these books. So thank you very much to Rachel Morello-Frosch for moderating, also ESPM's own. I'm new here. So this is our last ESPM spring seminar until April 25th or 6th, depending on my handwriting. But late April. So we'll send another reminder event before then. But we're glad we could be here for this one. And at 4:30, we will have a social hour in the courtyard. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to meet everybody, and it's great to see people. I've been absent a lot lately, so it's nice to be engaged in a seminar for the department, and particularly to celebrate the culmination of a lot of hard work of 3 distinguished colleagues. So I just want to do a quick introduction for everybody. Michael Mascarenhas is a professor in ESPM, and he's a first-generation scholar, and he's written several books. New Humanitarianism and the Crisis of Charity, Good Intentions on the Road to Help and Where the Waters Divide, Neoliberalism, White Privilege, and Environmental Racism in Canada. And he's also edited 3 books, but one is Lessons in Environmental Justice, From Civil Rights to Black Lives Matter, and I Don't Know More, as well as several peer-reviewed articles. And the book that we will be talking about today that is forthcoming in March is Toxic Water, Toxic System, Environmental Racism in Michigan's Water War. And this is Mascarenhas' 3rd ethnography to look at racialized precarity of water access. Our second panelist is Professor Youjin Chung, who is with ERB and ESPM. And she is a sociologist and geographer, and she focuses on issues of gender, power, justice, and access in understanding socio-environmental problems and their effects in rural landscapes, livelihoods, and lifeways in sub-Saharan Africa, with a focus on Tanzania. And her book is titled Sweet Deal, Bitter Landscape, Gender Politics, and Liminality in Tanzania's New Enclosures. And this book recently came out by Cornell University Press last month. And her work has appeared in lots of top peer-reviewed journals, in area studies journals, as well as in geography journals and sociology journals. And our 3rd panelist is Professor Sunaura Taylor, who is a professor in ESPM, and she is an artist as well as a professor and a writer. And her book is that she's going to discuss today, Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert, forthcoming from UC Press in May. She's also author of a prior book, Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation, by the New Press and from 2017, which received the 2018 American Book Award. And she writes not only for academic presses, but also for a lot of popular media outlets. And she has amazing artwork and has had several amazing exhibitions both nationally and internationally. And her work is situated at the intersection of disability studies, environmental justice, multi-species study, and art practice. So it's a pleasure to welcome you both. So today we're going to have some Q&A But before we start, I wanted each author to talk a little bit about the books because they're forthcoming. We haven't had an opportunity prior to read them. So I wanted to start with Sunaura, if you could talk a little bit about your book.
Absolutely. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be sharing this panel with Michael and Youjin and their amazing books, and I can't wait to read them. It's been really fun hearing about these books here and there over the past few years, so it's great to be able to share. So in my communities and discipline, it's sort of best practice to begin with the access check. So if there's anything I can do to make it more accessible for anybody, I know it can be hard to hear in the back or anything, or if I'm speaking too quickly for those on Zoom, let me know. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit embarrassing that after 8 years of writing a book, I need some paper to tell me what my book is about. But I know from like my last book that I actually didn't figure out what my book was about until I had given quite a few book talks. So bear with me while I attempt to do this. So on the most fundamental level, this book is really a intervention into environmental disciplines and environmental movements to make a case for why disability is a really integral concept to the environmental arena. So in this way, it follows, many interventions, feminist ecologies, Black ecologies, queer ecologies that show that social formation and systems of power are really, again, central to how we think about the environment, what we think of as the environment, relationships with the environment, etc. So there's numerous reasons why I make a case that disability is really important for environmental studies, but one of them is simply just because I think that disability is already kind of ubiquitous within environmental studies. We might not see that word a lot, but there's a sort of investment within environmental movements and environmental disciplines and ideas of healthy environments and healthy communities, right? What critical disability studies has shown over the past few decades, and what I'm trying to do in this book, is to show that disability and related concepts like health and illness are very malleable and powerful concepts that can be utilized for different ends and are often very depoliticized. We don't recognize them. They are, that disability is really not just a biological sort of issue or medical issue, but actually is a social and political and relational phenomena. So that's kind of like the broad intervention that I'm making. The book is really grounded in a particular place, particular community, Tucson, Arizona. And I will say a little bit about my choice of this site. So I wanted to kind of ground these bigger theoretical questions that I was trying to address in these, bringing these different fields together in a real place, real experience. And so for me, the sort of inevitable choice was to return to Tucson, Arizona, which is the site I was born near. My family was actually part of a litigation that took place around contamination that occurred at this site. So it's a way of kind of returning to this particular place that, even though we moved away from, has always kind of been part of my own narrative. How am I doing? I'm
Doing great.
okay. So, thank you.
Keep going.
Okay, so what is a disabled ecology, you might ask? So so for me, this concept really emerged really early on in my process of thinking about writing this book, as a way for me to kind of follow the trails of injury that emerge from sites of environmental harm. And by the trails of injury, I'm talking about like the human injury, right? The impact on human communities of, in this instance, a contaminated site, but also the sort of, to use my own language, sort of impairment or disablement of the groundwater, of the wildlife that was also impacted, right? These sort of multi-species impacts that this contamination had. So it's a way of kind of, on some level, literally mapping out these trails of injury. So these injuries are, or mapping out trails of disability and illness. So this is both material, but it's also rhetorical. So I'm also really interested in thinking about how narratives are that are told about these sites utilize or deploy narratives of health and disability. So for this case, I look a lot at how disability and illness are described in the litigations, right, on both sides, right, or how they were articulated in health studies, both to sort of deny and deflect blame, or how they are or how they were utilized by city officials to perpetuate racist stereotypes of the largely Mexican-American community that was impacted. And also how disability and illness are kind of narrated by community members themselves. So already this sort of like map kind of this concept kind of started to emerge for me of how just present conversations around health and illness are, and how kind of conflicting these narratives can be. I will just say really quickly that this is a historic case of groundwater contamination that took place from the 50s through the 70s on the south side of Tucson, which again is a largely Mexican-American neighborhood. And it was contamination that occurred from largely defense industries. So particularly Hughes Aircraft Company, which is now Raytheon, builds lots of missiles and precision weapons. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there because I feel like that's probably about 10 minutes and I could keep going, but I will leave it there.
Thank you. That's great. Youjin.
Okay, not embarrassed, also have it. Just so that I don't like ramble and like speak myself. So thank you for organizing this panel. So my book, Sweet Deal, Bitter Landscape, I mean, the early research for this book dates back to maybe 14 years ago. This was before I went to grad school and at a time when I was working in international development and campaigns and advocacy work, working with civil society organizations and social movements to try to stop global land grabbing. At the time, I didn't think I was going to write this book, but I have now. And it's been a really humbling experience, and I'm really excited and grateful for the opportunity to share the work with you and the world, and to have this space with two amazing colleagues whose book I cannot wait to read. So book Sweet Deal, Bitter Landscape is the first feminist ethnography to trace the lived experiences of diverse groups of rural women and men as they struggle for survival and meaning in the shadow of a stalled transnational land deal as they await development and dispossession yet to come. So in the first decade of the 21st century, legions of investors rushed to the global south to produce and speculate on agricultural commodities. And this was under the assumption that places like Africa and other parts of the global south were abounding in cheap, idle, unused land. And this phenomenon really accelerated in the 2007 and 2008 period when there are mounting global concerns about resource scarcity, food and energy insecurity, and financial volatility. And in my book, I focus on one particular case of a large-scale land deal in Tanzania that was signed by the national government and a Swedish investor. And the deal is located in coastal Tanzania in a district called Bagamoyo. So for this deal, the Tanzanian government transferred about 20,400 hectares of land, long settled coastal land, land on which thousands of people have been living for generations, to establish a sugarcane plantation to produce cane sugar, electricity, and ethanol. So 20,400 hectares is about like 40,000 American football fields, to give you a sense of the scope and scale of these land deals. So under this land deal, the company would have exclusive rights to occupy and use this large tract of land for 99 years, and they would pay an annual rent about 50 million shillings, which is about $1 per hectare or 40 cents per acre. Now, this land deal gained a lot of popular support and also really huge endorsement from the state. So top level government officials, the president, the prime minister, minister for lands. And the deal also gained a lot of promises of financial support from international development agencies and financial institutions, including the African Development Bank, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the Swedish International Development Agency. And this deal was supposed to cost about $500 million and will become the largest agro-industrial project in East Africa to date. So despite this formal legal land transfer and despite this enthusiastic support from state officials and donor agencies, 10 years after its inception, it was canceled. It was abruptly halted. So government officials, donors, and other journalists and observers kind of described this deal as having ended, canceled, vanished, and failed with no immediate or long-term consequences. And even one media outlet actually celebrated the cancellation, saying that it was a rare victory for the villagers because they were now spared eviction by a large-scale land deal. But in my book, rather than characterizing land deals that did not go the way project planners had intended, I choose to think with the heuristic concept. I introduce a concept called liminality, which I define as a historically produced condition, an embodied experience of being in between, this sense of being in limbo, where life is characterized by deep, profound, and quotidian uncertainty. So despite the news of the project's ostensible failure, people were still living in the shadow of this land deal. For instance, under the surveillance of paramilitary forces that the state and the district government had deployed to protect the project site boundaries, people were restricted from growing permanent crops with roots. They were told not to make improvements on their land and their homes. They experienced their crops being uprooted, houses being burned down, and farm tools being stolen, and physical violence and confrontation with the paramilitary really intensified. So living under this increasingly militarized, masculinized, repressive landscape, individuals and families had to really rethink and negotiate their everyday survival strategies. And so despite the formal end of this land deal, people were still experiencing this slow violence in which they remain in place, but experience diminishing access to resources, an eroding sense of belonging, and increasing pressures on their livelihoods. And as people described it, they felt like living in the shadow of this project was like living with one foot in and one foot out, like living in parentheses, living in a cage, while living like refugees on their own land and in their own nation. So the book traces this indeterminate trajectory of this land deal and how, even in its dull state, appended social life on the land in myriad gendered ways. So in the book, I focus on three central questions. So one is how and under what historical conditions did this land deal emerge and become stalled? And second, how and through what mechanisms of control did state and non-state actors try to govern this land deal during the many years of delay? And finally, how did this uncertain future of the land deal shape everyday life on the land for diverse groups of rural women and men? And I make three core arguments in the book. So in the first instance, although the book offers several explanations of why the project unfolded the way it did, I argue that the fundamental reason it could not take root is because the land deal became deeply rooted and enmeshed in what I call Bagamoyo's bitter landscape. And this is a landscape that is shaped not only by people's diverse gendered, cultural, material, ecological processes that are central to their livelihoods and identity and belonging, but also because of people's persistent struggles to remain on the land despite repeated cycles of enclosure and dispossession from the colonial times to the present. You couldn't do this land as long as people remain on the land, and they did. And secondly, I argue that people's lived experiences of and responses to the land deal were gendered in multiple and uneven ways. So First, I'll look at the ways in which gender in articulation with race and class and intersecting inequalities shaped the way it was governed, including through the deployment of predominantly male paramilitary forces on the one hand, and the deployment of predominantly female development consultants and their staff who were deployed to protect, nurture, and care for the to-be displaced populations. And I also look at how these intersecting power inequalities and identities also shape the multiple and sometimes contradictory ways that local women and men, from the poorest of the poor to the elites among the poor, reacted to this land deal and resisted this condition of liminality that pervaded everyday life. And then finally, I argue that the incompleteness of the land deal demonstrates this contradiction of post-colonial development and nation building in Tanzania. So by this, I mean that the deal illuminates this fundamental tension between the state's need to promote economic growth through the expropriation of resources and exploitation of resources on the one hand, and its need to secure political legitimacy from the poor rural citizens who constitute not only the vast majority of the nation's voters, but who fundamentally depend on these land and resources that the state needs for their own livelihoods. And the last thing I'll say is the book draws primarily on ethnographic research conducted between 2013 and 16, but I draw on more recent work from 2018, 2020 in the conclusion. And I know we'll talk more about the method, so I will just leave it there.
Great. Thank you.
Hey, no paper here.
Your book,
So, level, toxic water toxicity is about how historically, we've always, let's say, drank from two separate taps, one black and brown and the other white, whether that's swimming pools, bathrooms, toilets, public transportation, other things. We've always had separate and equal systems of service, and water is one that for me is striking. So I entered and got interested, of course, in the water politics in Michigan, Southeast Michigan, because of Flint. I had family in the area. I went to school at Michigan State for 6 years. I knew people. People were on the phone before the media knew, and people were yelling and screaming something's wrong. And so at the time, actually, I had 3 graduate students two were from Detroit, one was from Flint, and we were in upstate New York, and we started to kind of go over there and start doing ethnography and working with community citizens, doing citizen science work, and trying to raise awareness generally. And what was being constructed in the media mostly was that this was a technical problem, right? That people were asleep at the switch, didn't use the orthophosphates to treat the river water, and people got sick. And for me, as a sociologist, that just doesn't jive, right? So I started to look at what was behind a lot of this, and there's a lot of blame going on. A lot of blame by Schneider, the Michigan governor at the time. This is a failure of Black management. This is a failure of Black households to pay their water bills, and this really was striking, the racialization of this water problem. And so I started to kind of look into the historical archive around the construction of water and sewage system in Southeast Michigan. The cities are like all human beings. They need water to survive, and cities have very different strategies around how to grow water and bring it to the center to treat it, and then to distribute it. And in Southeast Michigan, redlining and white flight in the 50s and 60s, and then New Jim Crow made an amazingly segregated area where all of the urban areas, all the suburban areas were completely white. And then you had these spots of urban areas like Detroit and Flint that were 80% Black and other people of color. The interesting thing, because of that racial segregation, Detroit wasn't able to grow its water infrastructure the way other cities have. So LA, for example, they just annex places, right? They annex places, then they can take those tax base and use that to invest in the city infrastructure. There was a vivid racial politics in Southeast Michigan that county, drain commissioners, mayors, county representatives, were adamant that they were not going to be annexed to Detroit. They didn't want a black management. They didn't want, to be annexed to and associated with a black city. A lot of suburban, Michiganders, you know, they'll brag that they haven't been to the city for like a dozen years, right? This is a badge they wear. And so what Detroit had to do was to, borrow. Right? It's one unusual way of raising money for infrastructure. They had to continue to borrow money, They were heavily in debt. In fact, some of the debt financing was more expensive than servicing the lines later in the system. And that would have been, and over the years, there was repeated lawsuits to kind of take the water system away from them. And because white suburbanites didn't like the fact that these two black towns in particular controlled the price of water and they controlled the type of development that could go on in the area, right? So water was brought in from the Detroit system. It was funneled up to Flint, and from Flint it was distributed to the counties, the white suburban counties, and the same with Detroit. And so this long history of trying to wrestle that water system away from these two places. So this all comes into practice, if you will, with the election of Governor Rick Schneider, 2013. Republicans sweep into Michigan, right? They got all three levels of government. He gives $2 billion flat tax cuts to business, $6 billion in cuts to services, to health and human services, to vets, to K-12 schools, right? All the public services that people require and need and deserve. And he cuts the state transfer tax to the state, which buckles, right, the financial solvency of places like Detroit. Pulls away $532 million from Detroit in 1 year, gone, right? So you're hit with the 2008 crises. You're hit with a state that has aggressively buckled you, effectively made you insolvent in a matter of a year. Then he introduces PA Public Act 436. These are financial, when cities fall into financial insolvency, the state can step in and take over. Right? So it can effectively, they'll appoint one person, they'll come in, they will remove local elected officials and start to make all sorts of decisions. 19 states, not provinces, 19 states and Washington DC have emergency management laws on the books, but no law is as vicious as Michigan's law. So when emergency managers were put in place, Flint had 4. They cut collective bargaining, they cut pensions, cut jobs, raised rates, sold off city assets. The financial logic was actually illogical in many ways. And that's why I kind of call it this kind of financial fascism. Because it doesn't make any sense. Right? You're not there, they're not pointing these people to balance the books, they're appointing these people to change the political racial landscape of water provision in the state. And so, where was I going with this? So emergency managers, and this is a clearly racial thing, right? So Michigan has 14% African-American, right? Population, 80% of African-Americans lived under emergency management law over a decade. By 2017, 56% of all African-Americans in Michigan had lived under emergency management law, with only 3% of whites had, right? In a state where 80% of the population is white, right? And we know from research that cities that were financially bankrupt or insolvent that were predominantly white were not put under emergency management law. So we know there's some sort of strategy here. So 30 seconds. Okay, so so what ends up happening is, of course, you know that emergency managers were the perfect people behind the switch, right? Switching the river in Flint. the waters to the river in Flint. That caused, of course, now we know poisoning of at least 100,000 people. At the same time, what we didn't know is, well, people being poisoning in Flint, water's being shut off in Detroit for the same reason, right? 1 in 3 households, right, got their water shut off in Detroit. Both Flint and Detroit were forced into bankruptcy in order to kind of clean the slate, in order to bring in white folks from the suburbs to control the water resources and other infrastructures. And today, the Detroit Water and Sewer Department is called GLECA, which is Great Lakes Water Authority, and the ownership of GLECA is no longer with Detroit, but with the suburbs.
Thanks.
So they were successful.
Yes. Another form of grabbing.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I'm really, well, I want to ask you guys a little bit about how your approaches to undertaking and the research with the communities that you study. I would characterize all of your work as situated in the realms of and different approaches to thinking about environmental justice. So say briefly how you would characterize your research methods in terms of your relationships with the communities that you have studied, and how that engagement with the communities that you studied, the extent to which you think it has influenced the methods, your methodological approach, the interpretations of what you discover, and how you're disseminating the results of your work. Who's the audience for your book? So, want to start?
Say that briefly, okay.
I can answer any part of that.
Okay.
But basically the relationship with the communities in terms of how it shapes your methods,
Yeah,
et cetera, and dissemination strategy. Who's the audience?
yeah, definitely, great question. So, this book uses a variety of methods. It is definitely very based in textual analysis in one way. It is also a sort of a creative project in other ways, parts of it. But I would say that that it is very deeply rooted in archival work, as well. And then also this 3 years of living in Tucson and being part of the community and engaging with the sort of aftermaths of this contamination, because this is also 40 years old. The environmental movement that arose out of this contamination is about 40 years old. So some of it necessarily had to be kind of archival, because of the ways in which just because it was this historic case. But the engagement that I had, when obviously I chose to go there because I wanted to do some actual ethnographic work and get to know what was happening around the site. And one of the things that I was really surprised by is I think I just assumed that there wasn't really going to be anything happening because it was 4 decades old. And actually there's this incredibly active community advisory board run by the EPA. It's a little bit, I have conflicted feelings about it because it's a lot of representatives from industry, but it is this kind of consistent place where community members can still come. So I first started attending those meetings. Then I realized actually that there was more recent contamination that was coming to light, and that the other new generations of community was organizing around these other contaminants that were being discovered. And so I started meeting more people, engaging more in those kinds of meetings. And I also, I will say that the other thing that was also very surprising to me was just how many other academics there were. There was, this is the sort of environmental justice history in Tucson. And so, the University of Arizona really, sends their students there. And I will say that that really shaped my methods. Because it really, even though all of these scholars, there was no one who I was like, oh, they're doing unethical research or, you know, but you are very aware of the just the strangeness of being a researcher coming into a community when you're also confronted with all these other researchers who are also doing this work. So I'll just say that at one point there was a community member at one of the meetings who said, you know, I'm so glad that there's so many people who are interested in our history, but I wish that you guys would share your research. And obviously, I know there's all sorts of complications for why that's not done. You know, the IRB is there for a reason. But as someone who has also consistently been asked for my own story since I was very young, and who was also asked consistently by other researchers for my story while I was there, I felt it really raised this kind of ambivalence for me about conducting interviews, about what I was doing as a researcher. It really made me turn to the sort of labor that community members have already done repeatedly over the years, sharing their stories. So often I would find that community members had already given 5 interviews, you know, if you can include newspaper articles and research by other academics. And so I really tried to see that as labor and not as, you know, and I know that there's all sorts of ethical questions with that as a way of turning away from a community. So that was one strategy. Another strategy is some people, especially early activists, you know, who were the main organizers in the 80s, told me they were like, we, you know, support your project, but we are retired from, you know, talking about this, and we'll give you our archives. So I ended up with all of these archives of people's materials. So again, that became a kind of, so the relationship between the archival work and the ethnography kind of became really dynamic for me. And then I'll just say that, you know, I feel like this book is sort of one part of a project of an ongoing relationship with the community in Tucson and with this history. And so part of the dissemination is also a series of events that I'm organizing in 2025, which will be the 40th anniversary. And that's kind of a way of continuing a conversation and a relationship with the organizers there and the community there, in the landscape there, beyond sort of this book that I tried to write in an accessible way, but that is also, you know, it's not going to be accessible to everyone. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. So I want to ask you, and if you want to answer the further discussion, that's fine too. But I think one of the things that my students have often said is, when do you know, when you do your field work, when you decide you're done with the field work, and that it's time to stop doing interviews and collecting data and start analyzing it and start writing. So I wondered, you spend a lot of time in the field. So if you could maybe reflect on that question.
It's a great question. As you were saying that there's one of the reviewers for the book, he was describing it as, this is a book about an unfinished story. Yeah, there's really no ending, but anyway, no, there's really never an end because things take a life of its own and they continue. But anyway,
Yeah.
I think I'll probably try to reflect on that question in conjunction with the earlier
Yeah,
question. So my ethnography involves participant observation, interviews. I also combine archival and historical works, so oral histories, and participatory methods, including community mapping and participatory photography. So there's a lot of participant taken photographs and photo narratives throughout the book. And you know, those, when I choose methods, I mean, one, they have to correspond with the questions that I'm asking, but they also have to fit within the research context. So just because I want to use particular method, I can't just, you know, willy-nilly use them. And the participatory photography that I get many questions about, I think I never really went in deciding that I would use that method, although I had experience with the method before, but it occurred in the early stages of the interviews. I would kind of do sedentary interviews, you know, with elders especially, and we would talk and many occasions they would be like, okay, let's go, let me take you to the mango tree. Let me take you to this, like where this like house was before. And so there's a lot of like mobility and a lot of like visual elements to the interviews that I felt wasn't fully captured by sedentary interviews alone. So that's kind of one reason I try to incorporate that into the work. And, you know, this is a setting where people are like living in deep uncertainty, like a space-time of in-betweenness, as I called it. And that meant that participant observation involved like going to political party meetings, village assembly meetings, pubs, like spending time in people's kitchens. And it really occurred to me that spending time in those settings, there's so much gossip and rumor. And gossip and rumor is like very everyday part of everyday life, but in a very uncertain situation where people have no idea what's going on, gossip and rumor is like the main ways in which people share information. They have build this kind of collective sociality around what it is to live in this in-between space. And so doing participant observation in those intimate and more public settings really gave me an insight into how people are processing and making sense of their lives. And I, you know, when I initially started this project, I thought the project was gonna go ahead immediately. You know, I had totally different set of questions. My intention was to follow these households as they're being displaced in real time and to see how they're making, you know, do in this new resettled land, but that never happened. And so I had to constantly change my research questions. And even as I was doing the research, things were happening with the project and the state. And so I was constantly following new threads. And so I did feel like at a certain point after, you know, 18 months, I felt like I kind of reached saturation in the sense that people were telling me similar things. So, you know, kind of that's a level of, okay, feel like I have enough, but then the next week something would happen and things would like, you know, start up again. And so I never really felt like it was over yet, and it's not over yet. The story's not over either. And so I don't want to ramble, so I'll just stop there and then see if there are any other questions.
That's great. So you can answer either one of those questions, but I wanted to also get to another question, which I think is helpful to our audience. Which is, what's your approach to book writing? And what advice can you share about demystifying the process of writing books and making it less intimidating? And yeah, how do you approach that? Because I mean, I could say as a person who, I'm a scientist, I write a lot of journal articles. I have edited a book for which I wrote several chapters, but I've never written a book, and I'm not sure I have a book in me, but maybe someday I will. So this is also a very personal question. But I do feel like the monograph and how one writes it, it's a mystery, and it's nice to hear how people make their sausage.
You know,
Or make their veggie burger.
Thank you.
You know, as I angst through writing, my partner always says, why don't you just write articles? And I just like yell at her or something. You know, I see, for me, I see an article as a very separate thing from the book. Like, an article for me is a kind of a theoretical intervention of some sort for me. A book is a story, and that I need to tell, compelled to tell. And you know, as a scholar, I always find that we struggle, I think, or I struggle with writing humanity into our work, and that's why I go to do that work, because it's the stories, it's the struggle, it's the lived experience that people are going through that are so, you know, I mean, the things that activists do are just so amazing. And so trying to write that, I'm really compelled. I kind of feel responsible to some extent to kind of you know, I was doing this work, 6, 7 years ago. I feel like I should have had this book out 4 years ago. I feel like, you know, I missed my sweet spot of when I really would have had impact on policy, but maybe not. And so, you know, I write every day, no matter what I do. I'm writing a chapter right now. I have 2 hours I wrote for 2 hours. And when I was a grad student, I would write all day. Like I would get up, particularly when I was done my quals, I would just write. I would do my field work. I was constantly writing all the time, taking field notes, working, but always writing. There's never a day. I'm a little bit grumpy when I don't write. Like there's never a day when I don't write. And I think that's key. Like sometimes you write yourself into these, like I write myself in these huge rabbit holes. Like I don't know how to write myself back out. Like I don't know where I'm going with this. I just keep writing it and I keep writing it. And I don't know about the two of you, but I probably have more stuff that is discarded, like than the 120,000 words in the book. I probably have like 300,000 words written on forms and documents that I just have titles for that aren't included. And that's part of that process. And I find I write best when I'm angry. I shouldn't have said it. I was like angry about subject matter, right? Like I'm really passionate about this point that is just not getting its due attention, that is being used to harm people, that I feel like I need to bring to people's attention. And that's where I write. Those are the moments I kind of write hard. I will stay with that for a long time. Halfway through it, I was done. Like, I don't know, but I was like, I gotta get through this. I just gotta get through it. And I just keep at it. And that got me through. Writing groups help a lot. Colleagues help a lot. Talking about what you're doing, vetting your ideas, sharing your work, that helps a lot. Taking some time off of it. Yeah, I do that a little bit, but I'm not the type of person, like, you might have your own way of working, but I can't leave things alone. I gotta, so that way I just kind of stay with it. I've tried to make my writing more accessible. My first book was basically my dissertation, and I think I'm a terrible writer anyway, but my first book was not as accessible as it should and could have been. And I see that as a missed opportunity. I've tried to make this much more accessible. At many steps along the way, I've had people read chapters. People I've been working with, the community groups, read chapters or sections. How you think about this? How you think about that? And so they know what the book is going to say, and hopefully that's going to help. This last book, I'm working closely with one group, so all the royalties are going to them to help train young activists. Not that they amount to much, but and we're going to help advertise that book in the summer in Detroit. So.
Thanks. You guys want to add anything about the writing process or any, yeah.
I mean, you wrote 3 books and 2 books, and this is my first book, so it was a lot of like trial and error and experimentation. But I think I really, I mean, there are hard parts because you can't just will it to happen. You have to set aside time and really like think through this. But what I did enjoy about the process is, articles have kind of more formula, right? Kind of more template. Like you tell them what you're gonna, show them, and you show them, and you like tell them what you've shown them. But like you do that in a book too, but it's more kind of fluid. I felt like I could write in a tone that was more kind of storytelling. Of course, there's an argument and theoretical contributions, but in a way that's a little bit more fluid. And I try to write it in ways that is not only for academic audiences, but also other journalists or activists or policymakers. So at least I hope I did, but we'll see. And I'm the kind of a writer who I have a really hard time when I write something. The next day I have to reread what I wrote. And if I'm not happy with the single sentence or paragraph, I have a hard time moving on. And so in the beginning stages, I wasted a lot of time because I was just revising constantly. And so towards the end, I kind of realized I actually need to set that aside and actually just start a section afresh, and do the revision later. And so that took a lot of time and experimentation.
Yeah, I love this. I love hearing about people's processes. I am jealous, Michael, because I've always wanted to be someone who can write every day, but I am much more the kind of like, if I have I will look forward to these periods of time where I suddenly have like 3 days to myself. You know, my partner will take our kid and go somewhere, go camping or something. And then I will just like turn into a total, like, I won't eat. I'll just sit there for 3 days and get it done, you know, or get something done. So I feel like it's not a very, efficient, process, but it has been kind of the way that I've worked, that is finding these longer periods of time so that I can get into it and then stay in it and not have these kind of like interruptions that can happen just when we have jobs and kids and lives, you know? So, because I have a really hard time knowing that I only have an hour or only have a few hours. So like, I really like these, I look forward to these long periods of time. I would say like, you know, yeah, writing is just total, so much misfire and so much just having to sit there and do it, even though your body hurts and your eyes hurt and it's like agony. And then there's these glimmers of like, oh my gosh, it's working. And, you know, and then you might realize that actually it wasn't working, but for those moments, it's so amazing. And it feels so great. And you kind of, but I think the thing that's actually really helped me is when I'm reading, whether I'm reading for my class or I'm reading for research, I'm really attentive to what I like in other people's writing, you know, and what I don't like. And so then I feel like that helps me kind of develop a sense of the form of writing that I want to access. And it makes me feel more excited and interested when I feel inspired by other people's when I feel inspired by other people's words. Yeah, so I think that's kind of, I mean, yeah, it's just, you just kind of got to do it. There's no shortcuts. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. So, thank you all. Thank you all particularly for sharing the process of writing, and hopefully, I've heard that, like, I mean, I feel that writing is just, it's hard. It's always hard. And it's not fun a lot of times. I would say about 80% of the time it's not necessarily fun.
Yeah.
But it's worth it because of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to communicate. So hopefully that acknowledgement can help everyone else feel better when they're struggling at their end. So thank you for sharing, and congratulations on this amazing work. We're looking forward to reading it. And we're meeting at the courtyard?
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.